So we're starting our 6-week series on Lent, and during our Lenten season, which is 40 days before Easter, while we're preparing for the celebration of Easter, we thought we might examine a weird phrase that I invented. You see, here's how I invented this phrase. One day we had to shift websites, and we needed a new organization or whatever to host our audio. And so I found one, and I was making that transition, and they make this obscure website for you that just puts all of your audio out in the web, right, out in the internet, that we weren't going to use, but it was going to be out there, and there was no way to turn it off. So it had a little tagline. It said Village Church. And I thought, well, what describes the Village Church? And I thought, neo-monastic mega house church. I'll put that down. So I put it down because I thought, well, that's smart. Nobody's going to read this anyway. Lo and behold, a few years back, a reporter started tapping in, oh, well, what's this neo-monastic movement? That's really interesting. I need to do an article on that. Oh, well, guess what pops up when you search neo-monastic? This church. And so she called us, and lo and behold, we ended up on the front page of the Tucson Daily Star because of that. And then a national magazine picked that article up and called us and wanted to interview us. And so they wanted to know more about it too, this neo-monastic mega house church. So you can read their articles of what they figured out about it on the wall. We thought we'd talk about it. And so we're going to introduce it today, and we're going to introduce it a little differently. Rod and I and Mark are going to try to break down neo-monastic mega house church to get you ready to talk about liturgy and Trinitarian prayer and hot seat model and singing and eating together, things that we do together. So Mark is going to talk to us first.
All right. I'm going to talk about neo. And I know you're all really hoping for a nice, long, well thought out thing about the Matrix. Yeah? Neo. I'm not going to talk about Neo very much. That's about all we're going to talk about Neo. Neo, okay, so Neo means new. It means new. We like new things, right? We like new things? Yeah? No? All right, well, we're going to go with yes for right now, and then maybe we'll come back to no. We like new things. If I stood up here and I said, Oprah Winfrey called me and gave me $1 million, and you're all getting new cars. You get a car, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car. That'd be fun, right? I think so. You all want a new house, right? New experiences, a new guitar. That'd be fun. I want a new guitar. That'd be fun. I like new instruments. New is fun, right? You know what's really interesting about new, though, is it doesn't describe monasticism because monasticism is ancient. You know what else it doesn't describe? House churches. House churches are ancient. I think about Jesus going to Zechariah and saying, hey, let's go to your house. I'm going to eat with you. That's a house church. That happened a long time ago. It's not new. So new. What does this mean? You know what else we like about new? We like 2 Corinthians 5:17. Anybody know what 2 Corinthians 5:17 says? Someone say it. New creation. For in Christ we are a new creation. The old has, the new has. That's fun. We like that idea, right? I like that idea of being a new creation. I am a new creation. My old self, he's gone. I'm new. But that's actually kind of hard. It's kind of hard to be a new person because we also like the familiar. The reason we like this phrase is because neo sounds like a cool word, and we like the ancient ideas of monasticism and house church. But we're not really sure what to do with neo. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus is being questioned about his disciples and why they're not fasting. And he has this interesting picture. He says, "No one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins." See, here's the thing, is we don't like new things, actually. Do you like new things, Keith? Oh, great, thanks. We don't like new things. You know what? You don't want a new car. You want your car because it's familiar. You just want it to run right. You want your house because it's familiar. You just want the AC to work, right? We want to sit down in our comfy chair and have all the nice grooves right where our hands go, and you don't want new wine. New wine isn't good. You want old wine. You want wine from 1947, right? You want the really nice old wine that's aged and grown in the cask into having new flavors and new little hints of things. But you can't take new wine and put it into the old wineskins. The old wineskins grew with a new wine. They grew and they took on the flavor of the wine, and the wine took on the flavor of the old wine of the new wineskin, and it grew and it was good. You know, Jesus, it says we'll not get into that. I've only got 10 minutes. The new wine grows with the old wineskin. With the new wineskin. So when you put new wine into the old wineskin, as it grows with the new wine, it doesn't have it can't hold the new wine, so it bursts and you lose the new wine. You need new wineskins to grow with the new wine, to take time. You know, I wear these Birkenstocks. This is the second time I've talked about my Birkenstocks in a sermon. I didn't give them up totally. I wear these Birkenstocks, and you know what? These are some nice old Birkenstocks. They feel really comfortable. They've formed to my feet. They're kind of breaking right here. Who wants a new pair of Birkenstocks? A new pair of Birkenstocks? If I'm offering them right now. If you want to take a new pair of Birkenstocks, you want to take my Birkenstocks? Okay, here you go. So you got new Birkenstocks. They're new, right? They're not new. See, here's the thing. Yeah, they feel all wrong on your feet, right? Because you don't walk on the backs of your heels like that, and they're not going to wear it down in the right way. You need new Birkenstocks. You need new Birkenstocks. You need new wine. You need new prayer. You need new monasticism. You need to take the old things, sandals and wine and prayer, and you need to make them new in your life because you are molded by them and they are molded by you. When we practice prayer in our life, we discover new ways to interact with God, new ways for us to interact with God, and they grow with us, and we grow with them. It's important for us to see the new things in our lives and to grow with them. So if you want a pair of Birkenstocks, get a new pair of Birkenstocks, because then they will be crafted and molded to your feet, and they will feel really nice after a little while. And that's the thing, is that when we begin to pray, when we begin to read, when we begin to practice these things, they don't feel nice at first, but they grow with us and they become comfortable and good and rich. And every now and then we need a new pair of Birkenstocks, a new uncomfortability to grow into. So, Neo Monastic Mega House Church.
So I don't know if you've noticed, but the world is going crazy. If you don't believe me, you can Google it. And I did, in preparation for my 10 minutes, I did Google the world is going crazy. And guess what I found? People telling me the world was going crazy. Blogs and articles about the world going crazy. And in fact, the people who were trying to convince me that the world wasn't going crazy when I was done are the crazy people, right? I was pretty sure the world was crazy. And really what it feels like for all of us, I think if you just thought for a minute, is that we are on a boat that's being tossed back and forth. And we are trying to get our footing, and constantly that seems to be internally and externally how we feel. Now there's this word, monastic, that I'm supposed to talk about that I put in a description of our community. So maybe by the 2nd century, the 3rd century, these communities started gathering of people called monks or nuns, and they were in monasteries. And what a monk basically would do is they would make a vow to commit their life to prayer and constipation. I'm sure there was a lot of constipation going on there, and also contemplation. That's where they were contemplating. So we got prayer, we got contemplation, and we have solitude. These are the things that they were committing to. And here's what they were doing. They were committing to saying, no, we're not just regular adherents, regular people of the church. We're not the priesthood, but we're beyond that. We are going to commit to living in a space for all of our life. And we're going to do this thing. We're going to pray, we're going to contemplate, and we're going to have solitude together. Well, here's a news flash. The world has always been crazy, right? It is not any more crazy. The only difference is that when the barbarians are at the door, they don't Instagram it, okay? It takes 6 months for them to get there. So you got 6 months of peace before they invade, all right? So yes, there's some more anxiety that we might be experiencing, but the world has always been destabilizing and sort of restabilizing. Well, here's the thing about the monastery and the monastic movement for 1,500 years after Jesus ascended into heaven, and actually you and I are feeling this now, the effects of this, is that they actually served as a stabilizing force in culture. This is how it worked. Guess where the orphanage was? The monastery. Guess where you would go when you traveled, because there wasn't any safe inns, really. It wasn't like Motel 6 was not everywhere, right? But monasteries were. Guess where you would get food when you were traveling? At a monastery. Guess where you would retire if your family wouldn't take care of you? You became a monk late in your life and you retired. Guess where you would go if the law was chasing you for good reason or for bad? You would go to the monastery and they would offer you sanctuary. Guess where the people who could read were? At the monastery. Guess who was preserving Western civilization? The monastery. Guess where towns grew up around? The monastery and the church, right? This is where stability came from for 1,500 years. It was the monastery. It was this community, this practice. So what could we boil this all down to? Well, you could actually boil it down to 2 things that led to stability. One, a monastery, and the people within that monastery were hospitable. Now, different orders, I don't have time to get into monasticism, so if you are an expert on it, you can argue with me. But in general, they were hospitable places that showed practice. They practiced spiritual disciplines that you could participate in and observe, and they were hospitable to you, and that offered stabilization in a world that wasn't stable. Okay? So let me read to you a modernized version of the Benedictine vow of stability. This is kind of a modernized version of it, but this is what it is. We vow to remain all our life with our local community. We live together, pray together, work together, relax together. We give up the temptation to move from place to place in search of an ideal situation. Ultimately, there is no escape from oneself, and the idea that things would be better someplace else is usually an illusion. And when interpersonal conflicts arise, we have a great incentive to work things out and restore peace. This means learning the practice of love, acknowledging one's own offensive behavior, giving up one's preferences, forgiving. So, no, nobody lives at this building. Some of you might think somebody lives at this building, but nobody lives here, right? You can come and say you belong to the village and you can leave. Many people do. Or you could stay like me and others for 20 years, right? But here's the thing about why we would call this community a monastic community, or a new wine of monasticism, right? Here's why. It's because the new monasticism is about relationship. We take relational vows and we make relational commitments to one another. If you look at the Benedictine vow, it is ultimately about how you and I relate to one another and the commitment not to run away from ourselves and from one another. And so, for some of us, we have committed to stay here and practice and be hospitable for all our life. For some of us, have committed for 10, 15 years. And for some of you, you're just visiting and practicing and you will move on. But at the core, the village community takes a relational vow to stick with one another, to be hospitable, practice spiritual disciplines under the cross of Christ, and invite others to be part of that. And that, we believe, is transformative. Now, the Apostle Paul actually lays out what it's supposed to look like, because I would argue to you that all communities should be some form of new monasticism. We should be hospitable, and we should practice relational disciplines and the disciplines of Christ. Now listen to how Paul explains how we should be in community, and then I'll kind of touch on a few things, and then Rod will come up. This is out of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, starting in verse 12. It says, "Now we ask you, brothers and sisters, to acknowledge those who work hard among you, who care for you in the Lord, and who admonish you. Hold them in highest regard in love because of their work. Live in peace with each other." Point number 1, your leaders are working hard amongst you to practice relational disciplines, and the invitation to you, if you're part of a monastic community, the village, is to imitate them, to live out the life they are living. Because if you do that, it'll make their life easier, right? And if you ever listen to the underpinnings of Paul when he's talking about relationship, he says, please, please, please make it easy on your leaders, right? Care for the people who care for you. That's principle number 1 of a modern monastic community. It continues, and he says, "And we urge you, brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle and disruptive. Encourage the disheartened, help the weak, be patient with everyone." Okay, so the first thing that we're supposed to practice together then is that we are supposed to warn those who are idle and those who are disruptive. That's a collective thing. Why? Because if our community is to offer stabilization in an unstable world to one another and the communities around us, then we cannot have people being idle and disruptive amongst us. Because as soon as you guys are idle and disruptive, we become destabilized and we don't offer anything good to one another. So it is important for us to say, stop being disruptive. Stop being idle. The second thing, though, it says, is that we're supposed to encourage the disheartened, meaning the depressed. That means that you are to look at your community and say, who is disheartened? Who is depressed? My job is to walk alongside of you and give you courage, to be your coach, to sing your praises, to walk with you when you need to go to the doctor, when you need someone to pray with you, when you need someone to sit and listen. That's the invitation. That's what we're committing to. Help the weak. That means weak, right? It means you don't have what you need to take care of yourself, physically, mentally, emotionally. We're to help, come alongside, pick up, financially help, spiritually help, emotionally help. That's our job. And then he kind of makes it for everyone, Be patient with everyone. Here is the ultimate transformative thing, is if you commit your life to people to live out life with them, the thing that you will learn is patience. Because patience means long suffering in one direction, right? You and I learn to suffer one another in order to be like Jesus. Or as I like to say, sandpaper on flesh makes great community. Verse 15 says, make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. We live in a community of grace. That is the philosophy. So we warn, we take care of our leaders, we warn and act in community, but then we understand that the only way that stability happens is that when one of us injures the other, we don't pay them back. Justice and revenge is not part of a monastic order. And then last, we practice out the will of God. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will, God's will for you in Christ Jesus. So I don't ever want you to ask me what I think God's will is for you. Because Paul already told you what God's will is for you. That's it. There isn't anything else. If you say, is God's will for me to go here? And I will say, I don't know. Are you praying continually and giving thanks? Because that's his will. Right? Part of the practice of a monastic community is that we learn to be in constant conversation with Jesus together, but that we also change that negative narrator in our brain who's always talking negative into a narrator who's thankful. We live out a disciplined practice of thankfulness and of in conversation with God. And if we do that, we become a stabilizing force in our culture and a place where people can find refuge. And so we become the neo-monastic.
The neo-monastic house church. Not just a neo-monastic, but a neo-monastic house church. Acts 2:42 says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. 4 things. We love complexity. We love to complicate things. We like to make them deep and hard. We like to make things much harder than they actually are often. I think that's because complexity is a great place for us to hide. We build complex systems and structures. We imagine a million contingencies so that we can avoid doing the simple, hard thing that we really don't want to do. That's really hard to do. We want the kitchen floor to be cleaned. We don't really want to do that work. So instead, we go on Amazon. We find the best deal on Swifter wet jets, and then we do all the price comparisons with the competitors' brands. And we find one then on eBay, and except it uses those older version of the scour pads, and they're really hard to find. And then you have to do more price comparisons to figure out the difference. And then you pay extra because you actually need the mop tomorrow because some friends are coming and you want to try to impress them that with the myth that your floors are always really clean. And so you have to, it gets complex, right? Or you could just grab an old shirt and a bucket of water, get down on your hands and knees and scrub the floor. It's really easy to mop a floor. But if I don't want to, it's much easier for me to explain to Kathy why the floor didn't get mopped if mopping the floor is this really extremely complex project. I spent half the day researching this stuff, right? The early church is simple. It is really, really stinking simple. It is so simple, it's scary. Over the last 2,000 years, we've made it extremely complex. I wonder sometimes if we've done that so that we can avoid doing the simple thing that we really don't want to do. 3,000 people got baptized and joined the church in one day. After Peter preached what was a pretty amazing sermon where he told everybody that they had killed Jesus. So, and then they were cut to the heart, it said. And suddenly they had this emerging little Christian group of Christians, this little Christian church now, and they had to figure out how to assimilate 3,000 new people. Oddly, they didn't have some big emergency meeting to figure out what to do. People simply gathered in homes, and they did 4 very basic, very simple things. They listened to the apostles' teaching, they hung out together, they ate together, and they prayed. They didn't develop 7 steps to a deeper relationship with Jesus brochures and spread those out. They didn't execute this video series on the history of the law and the prophets and what to do about that. They didn't build some complex entity with a million rules and denominational structures that were focused on church growth strategies, and instead they just did simple things. Acts 2:42 says, the people got together and they devoted themselves to these things. The word devoted is an interesting word. Translated here, it is a very intense word. It's a passionate word. It basically means that they just persisted in these things. These things were the most important things in their lives. They weren't distracted by anything else. They didn't let anyone disrupt them. They just kept on keeping on and doing these very simple things. They were dedicated to simple things. The first thing that they did was they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. They were intensely pursuing listening to the apostles. They read the scriptures together. They pursued deeper understanding about what God had done and was doing. They learned more and more about Jesus. They studied it. They read about it. They heard about it. They sat at the apostles' feet. And that's kind of weird here because, well, Rod, you're saying, I don't know that we want to. We do that with the kids, right? What's an apostle? Well, really, the apostles were those first people. Like, it's not all the followers of Jesus ever that are apostles, but they were the ones who were called to establish this church and to bring the gospel to the world, and they wrote books of the Bible, and so basically it was reading scripture and spending time in it, and that's what you're invited to do, and to do that with devotion. They pursued a deeper understanding about what God had done. They were devoted to fellowship. They opened their homes to each other. Matter of fact, it's kind of interesting that early church gets known for how they treat widows. Right? Because if you were a widow in the Roman Empire, you were just worthless and hopeless and helpless and a beggar. And all of a sudden, they were inviting widows into their homes, and widows were going, wow, what is that about? Feeding them, caring for them. They befriended each other. They opened their hearts and their lives to each other. They chose to love each other. That's a choice, by the way. It doesn't always feel that, I just feel like, no, it doesn't matter what you feel. You can choose to love. And that's what they did. They devoted themselves to fellowship, to being in conversation with each other, chatting with each other, not trying to irritate each other towards talking about annoying subjects that had no bearing on their life. Remember, they were devoted to spending time talking to each other and to getting to know each other and caring for each other for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of what God had done. They were devoted to breaking bread. It's really great in this passage because nobody really knows what breaking bread meant, right? Like, the bread was kind of hard, but there was this idea of breaking bread. So there was first the idea of sharing bread, right? So you break bread and, I'm not going to eat the whole loaf myself. So there's no, squandering of it all. This is mine. Too bad you didn't get yours. break it, right? So there's a sharing. They call it the love feast, where you would simply give bread. Everyone who came ate. Then there were just a regular meal. When you sat down to a meal, it was a part of tearing off bread and eating it. It was part of your meal, along with the meat, the vegetables, whatever else you had. They ate together. And then it was most clearly also this, the Lord's Supper, the bread and the juice, the bread and the wine, the idea that Jesus' body and blood was offered and shed on their behalf. And so there was this deep recognition at every time they were together that the purpose was Jesus, and the purpose was what Jesus had done, and they devoted themselves to breaking bread. In other words, they went out of their way to make sure to share what God had given them, to make sure that those in trouble and struggle had that food that they needed to eat, and they pursued doing this together to remember what Jesus has done. And then finally, they devoted themselves to prayer. They prayed together. They prayed a lot. I don't know what your prayer life looks like. I don't know what it looks like at all. I know my prayer life gets pretty scattered, and sometimes I think, I'm so busy, I don't have time to pray. It's not the most important thing. They devoted themselves to it. So when they gathered together, by the way, prayer became this communal activity, but it was also when they were together or individually, they also passionately pursued praying. We often think of prayer as, and we say this, we lie to our kids about this too. Mark, you're going to have to clean up your act. But we talk about prayer as talking to God. But that's not prayer. That's part of prayer. That's half of prayer. The other half of prayer is listening to God, listening for Him to speak to us. We do that later on. We'll talk about that in this little series about Trinitarian prayer. Listening is such an important part of prayer. We sit there and tell God, we give Him our laundry list of stuff He's got to do for us and things He's got to take care of and things we want and all that kind of stuff. And we forget to just stop and listen for what He wants to tell us, what He longs for us to know and to follow and to hear. And so we need to listen, pray and listen. And they were devoted to doing that. That was their passion. The early church lived in houses. They met in houses. This was before the monastery era. This was, we got to assimilate 3,000 people. Imagine tomorrow, out of this fabulous sermon that you heard today, 3,000 people join the village. What you gonna do? Well, first you're gonna have to revive Eric, and he'll be in the hospital from stress, and we'll all be wringing our hands, not knowing what to do. Well, it's simple. If we all opened our house, let's see how many people are in the room, 50, there's another 50 tonight, 100 people. Can you get 30 people in your house? Well, maybe, if you open the garage and they sleep in the back patio and you put some tents up in the yard. A house, when Scripture was written, was a much bigger deal than it is now. It included your slaves and your servants and family members and extended family members and even more, and strangers who happened to be wandering by and needed a place to stay. But when you were in a house together, life is kind of strange, right? Living together in that kind of intimacy, let's face it, is difficult. Before Kathy and I got married, she gave me a little piece of green paper, and on it was written some little things that she wanted me to remember when we got married, and they were great. I kept that little piece of green paper wadded up, folded up in my wallet for years and years and years, and then it so disintegrated that first you couldn't read it, but I kind of remember what was on it. One of the things was the best way to win an argument with me is to take me in your arms and say you're sorry. Yeah. I didn't say I lived these out. I just said that. And one of them was kind of this, one of the things that she wanted was, she said, I hope you don't just be like my dad, where you're always just walking around in your underwear, half dressed, in an old ratty robe. I want you to not do that. But if you came and knocked on our door on any given day, right, I have to run and get my pants to be able to answer the door. And I think we all kind of do that, right? There's this familiarity and intimacy that happens, but then you see all each other's problems and issues, and there's fighting and there's arguing, and it's not this pretty scene, which is why we don't like any of this, right? Because intimacy and because all of our stuff gets revealed, our bad stuff and our good stuff. And we see a side, like there's no hiding in the house. You can pretend that the whole world knows a certain thing about you, but the truth comes out when you live in intimate relationship. But it's what God calls us to. The house church is to be in a house where you see each other's flaws and you see, geez, Dad's walking around in his underwear again. Please stop it, and we got to go deal with that. And some kid's out of control and throwing a fit, and you got to go deal with that. And then don't mess with my kid. Yeah, but your kid's annoying. And we have all that stuff, right? Because we're in community together. And so it's much easier to just create formal structures and blah, 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 and live separately and go to a place and not have to think about any of that. The early church knew something. Devote yourself. Devote yourself to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and to prayer.
Here we are. Now I am. You might not know, you might have noticed that. So I have lived in community for I keep turning my mic off. More than 20 years. In 1998, myself, Keith and Julie right over here, and another couple decided to live in a house together for 2 years. That couple left after 2 years, and Keith and Julie and Sue and I have been stuck with each other for the rest of that. If you haven't been to my house, you don't know that I have a table that when it's stretched out seats 22. And this community grew out of that house. And what's so important to me is for community, for Jesus, for hospitality, for eating together, to be lived out together in its, as Rod said, its ugliness and its beauty and its redemption. Well, that all spilled out because you can see there's more than 22 people. And Rod was being really kind when he said 50 tonight, because usually there's 70 or 80. All of you would not fit in my house anymore. And so when I was making that list and I thought, mega house church, when Rod and I and a lot of you started designing this place, Rod was insistent that our kitchen be the center. So that when you walk in, it's like walking into somebody's house. Because if the food is burning or the ovens haven't been cleaned, like last week, right? We hadn't cleaned the ovens, and so poor Mickey and Jill decided to cook in unclean ovens, and then they opened it up and smoke is flying everywhere. You come to church with smoke everywhere, right? You get a little taste of like what it's like at home when you're burning the things, right? Or when it smells really good. You know, you get that experience. There's something that happens when we gather around a table together and eat and celebrate who Jesus is. It's powerful and it's stabilizing. So we actually decided not to play as many songs on the back end to allow you guys to respond to this. If you have nothing to say about it, then that's awesome. If you would like to talk about it, I have a mic. And if you have some questions or some thoughts on these ideas, I'm going to hand that mic to Mark.
I have a mic.
So if you want to say something, if you don't, that's awesome.
Thanks. This is just a detail, but in the first passage, not the first passage, the First Thessalonians passage, the New International says instead of disruptive, it says timid. It says, warn those who are idle, encourage the timid. You said admonish the disruptive or something like that. So just curious about the...
Well, and I think, I believe that these are the older NIVs, and the one I had was the newer NIV. But yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I was going to look at I don't have my notes with me. Yeah, are you talking? What part are you talking about?
That would be...
Sorry, I know we're going to do some text stuff here.
14.
Verse 14, and we urge brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle and disruptive. And you said that text says...
Timid. Encourage the timid.
Oh, no, I think that's the next one.
What verse has the
help the weak?
Disruptive?
It said, encourage the disheartened and help the weak. It's just a different order, maybe. I'd have to look.
Well, yeah, I don't mean to split hairs. I was just curious. So.
Right. So now I've got to look at this Black Bible. So if anybody else has another question while I examine the other text that we... Glorious.
Could you say something about the word church?
Sure. Right. So the word, in fact, does not appear in the Bible. It's ecclesia, or the called out people, right? And we are the called out people, so we are the church. But as buildings became a central part of towns and cities, we started saying, well, we go to the church, and so it became a building instead of a people that are called out. So in the way I referenced it there, I was referencing it as a space. And here's why I was doing that, is that the man who discipled me, when he came to Tucson, he was a very apostolic kind of guy, and as he was planting churches and working on things, he said, most of the time when you plant a church in a city, you don't want to buy a building. You don't want a space. But in Tucson, it is so transient that people are looking for a place to call home and a place they can point to that says, that's where I belong. That's my community. In a town where and this is still a true statistic, if every single church, including the Catholic churches, so I'm talking about every person who follows Jesus, those buildings, if they were full on Sunday, it would only house 10% of our city. So people don't have a space that they say, well, that's where I belong. And when people come into a city, they are looking for a place to belong. In particular, I don't know, I was just looking at some loneliness statistics, and basically the average person scores a 44 or above on the UCLA loneliness scale, meaning the average person in the United States is lonely. Right, and in that, the fascinating, I'm just going to go off. I'm not going to answer your question, Lee. We can answer that later. But no, we can talk about it, and I'll write something about it to kind of clarify it. But here's the fascinating thing: people who report that they hang around their families too much on this loneliness scale are the people who report the least amount of loneliness. Right. That's all of you who hang around your families do it. It's really interesting because even though they drive you nuts, this connectedness creates a sense of belonging and a person to call and a people to rely on. Most of us, because of the culture that we've grown up in, which says that individual freedom is the highest thing and your individuality is the thing that you should be living out, right, separates us from everybody else. Because I don't want to rely on you, and as Rod was saying, I don't want to share my bread with you either, right? I mean, that's the thing, and I had a legitimate experience of this. I made this amazing sourdough bread, and my daughter and her, Dungeons and Dragons group on Friday were all doing their thing, and I put it down in the middle, and I thought, oh, I'll come back for a piece of my amazing sourdough bread. And 10 minutes later, I came back, and there was no amazing sourdough bread. Rod's thing, and sharing. I don't know. But the reality is that we find ourselves very lonely, and in particular, in Tucson, most people are passing through. They're not coming to live here. The average stay for someone who's not a native is 3 to 5 years in Tucson. So this is a very transient place. So the house, the church, the space, the building is important in this community. It may not be important in other communities. Where my brother lives in Cleveland, Tennessee, there are so many churches that, if everybody goes to church in the city, there'll be 10 people in each church, right? There's just so many churches. Church buildings, maybe a better way to say it. Any other questions? So you get me talking on this, and I'll go on and on and on. Corey, did you?
I'm remembering when the reporter came to interview about the neo-monastic mega house church, and I felt really nervous about how to answer that. And I'm feeling like if I was approached again, that I would have something more to say after how you guys have explained it. But I'm wondering if the 4 practices of listening to the apostles' teaching, being together, breaking bread, and praying, like those 4 things, would that be enough to explain who we are?
Yes.
Awesome.
Right. I kind of chuckled that Rod said, it's really simple. And for the next 6 weeks, we're going to tell you how we made it more complex. So, yeah. I think that's good.